Welcome to Decarbonizing Today, a deep dive into the Edmonton Metro Region's role in addressing the global climate crisis. In this episode, we have your Edmonton Global host, Sherry Bouslama, here with Sean Collins, the CEO of Varme Energy.
Sean, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here today. Appreciate the profile. A bit of background on myself. Sean Collins, born and raised in Alberta. My dad was in RCMP, so we bounced around a little bit. So born in Rocky Mountain House, and then grew up in Edmonton, and then Fort McMurray through grade 6 through the end of high school, and kind of fell in love with energy and energy transition from a pretty young age. Helped in university. I helped start an energy education charity called Student Energy, which was fun to sort of spend early parts of career just doing very deep dive on energy transition.
It's interesting to me, the connection between Fort McMurray and energy transition, because I think when we think of Fort McMurray from an energy kind of economy or industry standpoint, we don't often think of transition there. Can you, how did you get interested in transition specifically?
I think twofold. When you see the sort of raw intensity and magnitude of the Fort McMurray oil sands, it gives you a bit of a sense that that's the largest industrial project ever built on Earth is the Fort McMurray oil sands, and it's only 3% of transportation fuel.
Wow.
And so I think it's sort of a sense that, wow, we use a lot of fossil fuels in the world. From a pretty young age, you see that in a pretty stark reality growing up. And so I'd say sort of stricken by the need for transition when you see just the consumption that we use in the fossil fuel space. And you kind of live some of the impacts of climate change. Like Fort McMurray's had some of the harshest impacts of wildfire. And you've sort of, you sort of see both ends of the spectrum in real time in a place like Fort McMurray. That was the second part for me on energy transition, was seeing, holy heck, Alberta can build some big, tremendous industrial projects.
Right.
We specialized. We had one ace up our sleeve. It's that, our industrial might as a province and our energy might as a province. And for me, it's sort of always been this sense that sort of the long-term trend line is the world wants to trend towards a sustainable energy system. It seems like a clear and obvious trend line. And that's going to require the deployment of trillions upon trillions of dollars of industrial energy infrastructure. And so I think for me, it's always been a real passion that Alberta has the best set of cards to be dealt. Edmonton has the largest construction company in the country headquartered here. The reason we have the largest and biggest of everything in the industrial space is because of our existing energy industry. And we will still need joules and megawatts long into the future. And so I've always just thought that we should take all of those skills that are huge competitive advantages in this new and emerging industry where no one really has any talents or experiences. There isn't a geothermal industry here. There isn't a nuclear industry here.
Right.
There isn't a waste to energy industry here. So who most likely has the tools for success in that? It's your large existing industry that knows how to build these things at scale. And so just really passionate that we have the best set of cards of anyone in this space.
Yeah. So you said even as a student, you were interested in this, and you started talking about organization or a club that you started.
Yeah, started as an event. We did this International Student Energy Summit in Calgary in 2009 and had students from about 25 countries show up.
Oh, wow.
And that really was sort of a sense that there was a groundswell of youth interest around the world in sort of a pragmatic solutions-oriented space on how do we accelerate the transition to a sustainable energy system. Sort of holding up placards and protesting in the street doesn't permit new projects to get constructed and sort of tactically move the transition forward.
Yeah, it's a more pragmatic approach. Yeah.
Pragmatic, realist, and then sort of getting into the weeds of what are the things that are preventing the transition from happening.
Right.
And a lot of it's policy and regulation and incentive and capacity building and sort of, So really amazing organization. That was, I ended up going full time in that organization once we got status as a charity in 2012 and moved down to Calgary for a few years and really helped lift that organization in a really fun way. Only downside is there's no equity kicker in a charity. And so sort of keen after that to get into for-profit project development and sort of go after the economic opportunity that exists in energy project development.
Okay. And so where did that lead you?
Yeah, so after the student energy story, we all started to also graduate, and we were all graduated, and we're no longer close to being students. And so I got into geothermal project development. I helped co-found a company called Terrapin Geothermics. led them through first geothermal resource rights in the province, and really sort of how do you unlock the regulatory framework for new emerging renewable energy. So really sort of cut my teeth in project development and the for-profit space in that organization. I'm still on the board.
I was going to say that company's still around and functioning. And
developed this Alberta #1 project, first permitted geothermal project in Alberta. Through a very treacherous regulatory environment for geothermal, both in Alberta and Canada. Geothermal was included in the renewable energy moratorium, despite having paid a well security liability to the province. And so when you sort of dive into these new industries, there's all this sort of hype and excitement, and you sort of realize there's lots of very serious, significant, real challenges. There's many significant roadblocks and barriers as to why any of the industries that don't currently exist. And there's usually a reason for that, because if it was easy and simple to make money in that space, or if there was a clear regulatory pathway,
it would have been done.
It would have been done by someone. And so I think that just sort of the motivation that it's fun to go to work every day, sort of trying to just chip away at the iceberg and see, like, can you figure out how to get it done in a way in an environment where it hasn't gotten done yet.
Okay. And now you're CEO of Varme Energy, which is a subsidiary of a company from Norway, if I'm correct, Green Transition Holdings. Is that the name of it? Yeah. So how did you end up working with this company?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a bit back. The connection originally is through student energy. So we in 2013, we did our first student energy summit in Calgary in 2009. Then we did Vancouver in 2011, and we sort of branched out internationally and did one in Trondheim, Norway in 2013. And the co-chair of that event was Andreas Carlson, who we maintained a close friendship and relationship with over the last 12 years. And he had been brought into a Norwegian private equity group, Green Transition Holding, that was, so kind of quick thesis there. In Europe, there's over 500 operating waste energy facilities. And now those facilities are catching the wave of carbon capture.
Okay.
And the thesis for Green Transition Holding was there's opportunity to develop, construct, and commission new waste energy assets with carbon capture as the feature. And so recognized that there was a global opportunity in the space. Andreas was tasked with looking at international opportunities and where might be good markets for them to enter. And he knew me in Canada, so he gave me a shout. And especially as they articulated how carbon capture and transportation and sequestration is done in Europe offshore, in a deep sea rig, and the cost associated with that, it sort of became very obvious. You're sort of over $100 a ton cheaper cost to transport and sequester the carbon in Canada versus Europe. And so, like, garbage is the same, power is the same.
Right.
It's really the carbon capture difference in Edmonton that made a significant difference. And so about 2.5, 3 years ago, we started the process of setting up Varme in Canada, and been off to the races ever since.
How were you able to convince them that there was a business case to do carbon capture here as opposed to somewhere else?
When you've got cells in an Excel model, and over there's transportation sequestration cost is $200 a ton, and over here ours is $50 a ton. That's
pretty easy thing to sell, I guess. Yeah.
In business school, they said there's no competitive advantage as strong as cost, and so Edmonton and Alberta has a raw structural cost advantage in carbon capture.
Right.
That on its own stood merit. And then over the last year, 2 years, we've been thrilled. The federal government budget 2022 announcement of the 50% investment tax credit for carbon capture, fundamental game changer. If you now are a $100 million carbon capture plant and you get a 50% tax credit, game changer to your economics. And then Alberta announcing last year the 12% Alberta carbon capture incentive program. We now say, sort of, when you stack Edmonton having the biggest CO2 pipeline in the world and the lowest cost, Canada having the best tax credit jurisdiction, and Alberta having the best tax credit within that, Edmonton has the best CCS story on earth. And so the raw investment fundamentals here are better than anywhere else.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that there was really carbon capture happening in Europe. How long have they been doing it there? And can you speak a bit maybe about the differences between how it's being done there and how it's being done here in the Edmonton region? Yeah,
so I would say in Europe, they've spent probably longer time horizons on some of like solvent studies, amine studies, sort of the capture technologies. There's some pretty advanced stuff going on over there. But in terms of actual, like, CO2 is a gas, and the gas has to go underground somewhere. Where do you do that? And the challenge in Europe that is sort of missed by some folks in North America is they don't have onshore gas storage. The reason they're so reliant on Russian gas is because most of continental Europe has no gas. And so they're importing it from places like Norway, Russia, Ukraine, the whole North Sea development, but almost all of their hydrocarbon development is offshore. And so it's offshore platforms, it's ships, it's helicopters. And the only major sequestration project in Europe is the Northern Lights sequestration project in Norway, where it's up to a multi-100-kilometer ship ride for the CO2, individual load by individual load of CO2. And so
seems inefficient.
It seems inefficient. And so the waste energy facility in Oslo is brownfield retrofitting a carbon capture project where they're then trucking the CO2 down to a terminal at the port to put it into tanks, to put it onto a ship, to take it offshore and inject. The carbon intensity of that whole operation and every touch of that molecule is significant, as well as the cost, just the raw cost. They've offered 10 years free transportation and sequestration to projects, and people aren't building it.
Yeah, I know both you and I were at COP28 this year and had a chance to connect there. But talking to people at COP28 about carbon capture technology, I noticed there was a lot of skepticism around the technology. Do you think that has to do with maybe what they've seen in Europe and how they don't see the business case for it?
Yeah, for sure. I do. I think sometimes I find in energy and climate and energy transition, people get trapped into this sort of silver bullet ideology or mentality that, hydrogen is the perfect thing everywhere forever,
right,
or geothermal is the perfect thing everywhere forever. And generally, there's like a pro and a con about everything in energy. And I think carbon capture is one where in some places it makes a tremendous, extraordinary amount of sense. Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, Saskatchewan being one of those places. If you're now having to add $300 a ton transportation sequestration cost onto your carbon in Europe, that doesn't make sense. And we would argue if it is $50 a ton here versus $200 a ton here, wouldn't it make more sense to harmonize those credit regimes with one another? You could put 4 tons more carbon underground here for the same dollar per ton that they're paying over there to more expensively and with higher carbon intensity. And so it's not a silver bullet. It is, I think, fundamentally your geology and your existing infrastructure. Sort of challenge for Europe, too, is that there isn't really any CCS infrastructure or hubs or terminals or ports or anything that are built today. And so if you're a waste energy with carbon capture project in UK and you have a project, you have waste, you have energy, you have land, but that CO2 terminal that's supposed to be built in 2029 doesn't get built, you're sort of, you have this project on project risk.
Yeah.
In carbon capture, which the carbon capture project risk is so significant. So again, back to Edmonton having the best CCS story on earth, we have so much built infrastructure already today. You have the Wolf's Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, you have Shell's Quest project, you have 25 hubs that are into the regulatory process with the province of Alberta. And so you can come touch the pipe today. And that makes such a difference in that it eliminates the project on project risk. So you're seeing now like Heidelberg and Air Products and Dow and Varme, like anyone who wants to do sort of X plus carbon capture has sort of found Edmonton.
They're choosing the Edmonton region.
Cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the business case so far. What about the technology? Would you say it's proven technology? Because I think there's skepticism even around that.
Yeah. Again, it's so funny to me that exists in this ecosystem. My first year in school, I did science. I was in sciences before switching into commerce.
Okay.
And was in organic chemistry. And so I may be tainted by some of this as being just sort of a nerdy scientist. But CO2 gas is a physical gas that you capture and put in a pipe with a flow meter. And so when people say things like, CO2 CCS doesn't work, or there's these sort of narratives that emerge of like, it's just all going to leak. And it's one where in other parts of the world, there's worse stories for CCS. In Edmonton and Alberta, it's sort of come touch Shell's Quest project. They put 8 million tons a year, 2015 to today, over 1 million tons per year, safe, reliable, underground.
I think that project has performed better than they kind of said it would to begin with, right?
Yeah. And so it physically works. It's just how expensive is it? What are the incentives?
Right.
What's the structure? And can you make a premium now on whatever it is you're selling? So if you're selling low carbon fuel, can you get a premium for that to justify the cost? And so it works. It without question works. It's just sort of, can we now tweak the nozzle to make it work at scale and incentivize new investment here, which seems like it's happening.
Okay, so I'd like to switch gears a bit and now talk about Varma specifically and the project that you have planned for the Edmonton region.
Awesome. What would you like
Favorite
to
thing to talk about? Well, first of all, tell us about the project.
Sure. So Varma, we're developing a waste to energy with carbon capture facility in the industrial heartland in Strathcona County. So we were successful in securing a long-term feedstock agreement with the city of Edmonton through an open competitive RFP process that they ran last year. And so thesis for us is sort of waste to energy with carbon capture is the three legs of the stool. So municipal solid waste, the black bin garbage that we currently truck to a landfill about 100 kilometers outside of town. Instead, that waste, same trucks, same everything, the waste that we right now tip into the landfill to create a 100-year environmental liability instead tips into the tip floor of our facility that will be constructed. You burn that waste in a furnace, so a combustion process. Similar energy quality to coal. Waste in Edmonton's about 80% of the energy density of coal.
Okay.
So kind of weak coal in terms of energy value, but still quite reasonable amounts of energy that you extract out of it. And then feature for us is that you capture the carbon at the exhaust stack and sequester that underground. And so it makes the energy you generate technically carbon negative. You avoid all the methane emissions at the landfill. And so we sort of use the tagline, a landfill-free, carbon-free solution to our solid waste.
Sounds like a win-win situation, really.
Yeah, it's one we're really obviously biased, but pretty fired up about. We're sort of in the running to be the first greenfield waste to energy with CCS day one facility in the world.
Right.
There's 2,000 plus waste energy facilities in the world. There's some that have done retrofits of partial carbon capture, but sort of day one contemplated waste to energy with carbon capture as the full stack of the facility, sort of contemplated to be amongst the very first greenfield.
Waste to energy in Canada as well, right?
Canada's built 4 large waste energy facilities so
Okay.
far, none in Alberta.
Gotcha.
Burnaby, Quebec City, Durham, Markham, there's a couple.
Not as prevalent, though, in North America than it is in Europe, right?
Right. Norway, smaller population than Alberta, has 19 operating today. We have 0.
Right.
And so there's about 100 million tons being processed in waste to energy facilities in Europe. And in Canada, we have 26 million tons going into a landfill. And so there's an opportunity to build 100 facilities in Canada.
Right. We haven't had the same kind of pressure in terms of space, I guess, right? We have the space to operate landfills, so maybe haven't had the same pressure that Europe has to figure out what to do with the waste.
Yep, that's for sure part of it. I think here it's maybe something we tell ourselves that we have all this land, and so whatever, we can just put garbage there. I think
Doesn't sound great.
no, and Europe, I think they have, like, if you get outside of any major city in Europe, like you're into the countryside, they're
Right.
like they have like a landfill itself is not a huge, massive sort of like 800 acre sprawling metropolis, and so it's more. I think there they took the sense that that's the landfill sites are the number one most concentrated sites for methane generation. Sort of
Right.
landfills, cows, and oil and gas are the only 3 sources of methane over 20%. And there's millions of cows and hundreds of thousands of oil and gas sites, but only hundreds of landfill cells.
Right.
And so there are these really concentrated sources of methane, CH4, which is 28 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. And so from a global warming impact, landfills it's all caused by humans. All that is human caused waste. And so in terms of your sort of direct impact on a high impact greenhouse gas, that was an obvious one.
Right.
I think there they realized, sort of woke up to the fact it's actually the GDP minimizing move. Like, you end the life of your waste when you put it into the ground forever. And when you use it, when you do source separation, when you do recycling, when you do composting, and then even waste to energy. Now, if you get all that coal equivalent value out of it, that's straight back into the economy.
Right.
Now for us, all the carbon credits are straight back into the economy and decarbonizing our core industry. We pull your about 3-4% of waste is metal. So that metal is magnet and eddy current separated out of the ash and is back into the economy, sort of preventing new mines and refining operations from having to exist. And so each of those steps is adding GDP to the economy and jobs to the economy in a way that doesn't exist without these sorts of strategies. And so I think Europe just sort of caught up that it is a winning issue. It's one where, and they took a really slow, measured, stable approach to it. They did a landfill ban. and had a lot of countries did sort of slow, steady landfill taxes where they just added like $5 a ton tax over 20 years. So sort of slow and steady. We just want to eliminate any new landfills, slowly make it more expensive, and then just slowly that tips the economics to, at some point, now instead of tipping to a landfill, if you could tip to a waste energy facility or an anaerobic digestion facility, it just sort of works. And now you get all these new industrial facilities that get built off of something that we currently bury into the ground.
So what do you think we need to do to catch up?
So Alberta and Canada at large there is no comprehensive landfill elimination policy that exists. We've never taken sort of a targeted approach to say we don't want these things anymore and we want to the other angle, I think, is that if you make a choice around sort of eliminating landfills as an option, you sort of force it into the circular economy. I ask the question sometimes, like, what's the definition of the non-circular economy? And to me, it's that it leaks out of the economy and we throw it away and it's wasted and we don't recover it for any value. And sort of waste to energy is one of those, like, it's like a structural safety net where if you aren't allowed to throw things away into a landfill and it must go somewhere else, then you're a structurally circular economy. There isn't a leak point where things get thrown away and lose their way out of the economy.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So back to the project, though, you guys had a pretty big announcement this morning that I think is getting you one step closer to FID. Can you talk about the announcement?
Yeah, really happy today. Minister Schultz announced $2.8 million in funding from Emissions Reduction Alberta to support the FEED study on our project here in Edmonton. So thrilled at being embraced by Alberta on the project. Really cool too that the funding comes through Emissions Reduction Alberta, and so we sort of see this is historical emissions levies from the province that are now helping finance us to decarbonize the future of emissions in the province. And so really happy at the level of support, and will really de-risk our ability to execute the FID on our first project.
Amazing. And I know, was it maybe couple months ago, you guys had another big announcement about Canada growth funding that you guys were able to access. Can you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, in June, we announced Canada Growth Fund providing carbon credit offtake for our project, as well as commitment to equity financing the project at a successful FID. And so that, from our understanding, was the first carbon credit offtake for the Edmonton region. So as a very proud Edmontonian, we're very proud to bring the first of those credit structures into the region. The sort of Coles notes on that. They've agreed to backstop 100% of the carbon credits generated for the project, which is estimated to be about 200,000 tons of credits generated per year. And so now for a 15-year term, we have no risk on the ability to monetize the carbon credits for capture, sequestration, and methane avoidance on the project. So huge lift forward. When we're waste to energy with carbon capture, and carbon capture is the sort of newest and riskiest part of this, that's been transformative even since we've announced it, and just sort of the inertia and momentum around the project.
You've touched on it a bit earlier in the conversation, but how important is it to a company like Varme for these types of programs to exist, these types of policies and funding programs and things to support you?
Yeah, critical. We for us, it's interesting because our standing up our business is a bit in response to some of these incentives and programs that were created, sort of as Andreas and I were contemplating and evaluating if we were going to make the entry into Canada, and the 50% tax credit got announced. It's sort of, the government is telling industry, we would like to see you go do the following things. And government is allowed to set policy and incentives and regulations and carrots and sticks. And so it's one where you're seeing it. There's been like a social dynamic and pressure around energy transition that's being responded to with regulation policy and whatnot. And so for us, it's this interesting environment. Like, generally would preach with a choir of policy stability. We just sort of created all of these new mechanisms and structures to try to incentivize.
Carrots, though, mostly, right?
Mostly carrots.
Yeah. Have we done sticks here?
We seem to be sort of, we can't open that door.
Okay.
And so I don't know, maybe this is being an Alberta boy. I don't know if I think in sticks. It's sort of,
that's fair.
You can carrot your way. And even some of the design of these carrots, I think, are smart. Like, the tax credits fall away in 2031 or go to half in 2031. And even the way the province calculated grid displacement factor on power, where you're sort of like, get online fast and you get more credits, and sort of you can design these mechanisms to sort of be lucrative at the start to make sure we actually build the things. Like sometimes we get too worried, like, did the first ever nuclear project accidentally make money? Like maybe we should let the first one make money before we worry about these things. So I think the way they've structured some of these work and are designed to take the burden off of taxpayers over time. I think the concern is if you just create all these new complicated structures and regulations and then start messing with them constantly, there's never a window where anyone had enough time to sort of pull something off. And so right now the window's open. There's lots of stuff being announced in Edmonton. So let's just keep the window open.
What's the thing that's kind of maybe the next step to actually get to an FID?
Yeah. We got a few more things in the journey towards FID. A lot of it right now for us is provincial engagement. And so a few different components of regulatory approvals.
Okay.
So
in theory, though, with this announcement this morning and the provincial funding, you have support in theory, right, of what you guys are doing.
Yeah, so far we felt very supported. There's lots of interesting and sort of innovative structures the province has taken, including the designated industrial zone structure that's designed around fast track regulatory approvals.
Okay.
So don't want to speak sort of too openly about specifics of those processes, but just sort of in stream with those and sort of happy, confident where we're at, but we don't control the outcomes of some of those processes. And so those as things we would interpret positively. Some of the changes to the AESO and the restructured energy market is creating a lot of uncertainty on the power market, and the changes to the cluster timelines, and so just sort of regulatory approval timelines as is a common thread for Canadian energy projects.
Right. Well, and especially being a first, right? Like being the first is never an easy kind of path to take.
Yeah. And so I think for us, we're pushing, can we get sort of first of kind project designation as a concept? Because it's one where if you can, I think it would be helpful if the province took more of that structure. We did it a bit with Quest. If you look at the original carbon capture protocol, it had time-bound rules that people called the Shell Quest rules. They were sort of designed to make sure that Quest project happened. And again, you can complain, did Shell make too much money on the first project? Whatever. We built the first, biggest, best carbon capture project in the world. And so I think that just sort of, how do you create some real sense that these first of kind projects that are new and emerging, if we get the first ever cement plant with CCS in the world at commercial scale, the sort of generational impacts that creates for Albertans is transformative. And so not every project needs to get those things, and the 13th cement plant in Edmonton doesn't need to get those. But these new and emerging industries that are really like fragile, I think are worth paying a lot of attention to.
When you think about the global impact that these projects can have, like it's transformative.
100%. Yeah. I don't want to get too like fired up, but you see Edmonton
Get fired up, Sean.
You see Edmonton right now. We're leading that for all kinds of industries. It's like net zero chemicals, it's net zero cement, it's net zero waste to energy, it's net zero diesel. Like all of these things, we're doing net zero here first, and that's amazing.
Yeah, it's an exciting story to tell for sure. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you want to talk about before we finish our time together?
What's new with you? What's going on over in your world? What's stuff that is exciting for all the startups in the world?
Yeah, what's really exciting at Edmonton Global right now is telling the story of all these big projects that are happening. We've been talking about, Canada's path to net zero runs through the Edmonton region. So I find it a privilege to be able to share those stories of companies like Varme, companies like Dow, like you mentioned, the first net zero polyethylene facility, companies like Heidelberg, which are working to, bring net zero concrete. Like if you think about the impact that could have on the whole world, if we can create net zero concrete, it's incredible.
Yeah. Awesome. We've got to go all in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for being here with us this morning,
yeah.
John, and really excited about the project and looking forward to talk to you when you finally get to FID.
Yeah. Appreciate it. Thanks so much for all your support.
You bet.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Decarbonizing Today. To stay up to date with the series, make sure to subscribe and follow us on all of your favorite social media platforms. We'll see you next time for another engaging discussion with Lindy to continue exploring how decarbonizing tomorrow starts today in the Edmonton Metro region.